So we have the Osterburs said they had a school event and they're going to watch this later, and a handful of other people said they were busy tonight. So thank you for everyone who can come. A couple of you said you had to leave early, so if you leave before 7, though, I'll know that it's because I said something to offend you. But if it's at 7, then we're good. So. But today is actually it's going to be a difficult one. I know I'm saying that a lot lately, but so 5th and 6th commandments. So 5th being you shall not murder, and 6th being you shall not commit adultery. Thank you much. Would you hand those out, please? Oh, thank you.
For anybody else like that.
Okay. No, the original 2-sided one is Mr. Furman's. That's only a 1-sided one, though. There it is. There it is. It's that one right there. This one right here.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay,
Okay, thank you.
The one with 3rd and 4th.
5th and 6th.
I'll check my email, see if they tell me it's down.
Okay.
Well, I'll worry about it afterwards. We're not going to let it bug us for now.
It
So,
went down Sunday.
what was it?
Oh my God, it was storm.
All right, wonderful. All right, well, let's begin with the prayer, and then we will get started. All right. Lord, our Savior, enlighten our eyes to know all your mercies, and create in us such hearts that may be truly grateful to you. Forgive us our sins for the sake of the sacrifice of your Son on the cross. Enlarge our hearts to walk in the way of your commandments, and to pay you the sacred vow made in holy baptism. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so first of all, Noah, since you stand on up for us. Pat, it is so good to see you walking so good. You're here and you're walking good. It's good to have you. Yeah. All right, turn around and face everybody else. What is the first commandment? What does this mean? What is the second commandment? What does this mean?
You should fear no gods, not curse, swear, use satanic cards, lie, or deceive by his name, and call on him every trouble and pray present with thanks.
Third commandment.
Remember the 7th day by keeping it holy.
What does this mean?
You should fear no gods who despise patron's word, behold it sacred, and loudly hear you.
And fourth commandment.
Honor your father and mother.
What does this mean?
You should fear no gods who despise or anger our parents and other authorities, but honor them, serve and obey them, love and cherish them.
Good. Nick, you reading it every night to your folks? No, that's just a reminder. We'll work on all of us taking some initiative on this. And that's something that we are all taking initiative in our own ways. I would be shocked if anyone here had done all of this every day. We've all done little bits of it and we're all working at it. You're getting in a new habit too. So I'm not throwing stones from my glass house. We are all working on it together. So today we begin with the 5th commandment. So everyone has out your congregation at prayer. Let's look at the bottom. All right. What is the 5th commandment? What does this mean?
You should fear God.
So the negative, we should not hurt or harm our neighbor with his body, but instead help and support him in every physical need. So let's read the top excerpt from the Large Catechism. God and government are not included in this commandment, nor is the power to kill taken away, which God and government have. To punish evildoers, God has delegated his authority to the government, not parents. Therefore, what is forbidden is this commandment is forbidden to the individual in his relationship with anyone else, but not the government. So let's talk about what this is not. Today for us was a busy day. Today is one of our semi-regular butchering days. So 20 roosters went from my backyard to my freezer.
Who did not want to be butchered.
Yeah, they didn't want to be butchered. Go figure, right?
Oh.
Can't imagine why. Yeah, Noah got a little scratched up from one of them. Got a couple last licks in. So we talked at the very beginning about natural law, and we talked a little bit about revealed law, specifically how God tells Peter, rise, Peter, kill and eat, right? So we are not talking about animals. God has given us dominion over animals. We are to do good by them as much as you can. We treat them well and hospitably, and you take care of them, anything that is in your charge. But when the time comes, it goes in your belly, and that is okay. So there's something else that we are not talking about here. The difference in murder and killing. So in Romans, it says that the government does not bear the sword for no reason. Now, is the sword an offensive or a defensive weapon? Both? Yeah, it's both. I think predominantly it would be considered an offensive weapon. If we look at, as an interesting side note, with Jesus in the garden of, if I can say it right, Gethsemane, where Peter gets out his sword, takes off Malchus's ear. Jesus didn't say, "Oh, hey man, I'm not about that sword stuff. I don't know where he got it, right? I'm not cool with violence." He just said, "Put it away. Now is not the time." So an interesting note that apparently the apostles did carry weapons with them and were prepared to use them, however effective or ineffective we can debate. But just an interesting side note there. But they do not bear the sword for no reason. So what is the reason to bear a sword?
Defense.
Okay, defense, to kill. Yeah, to kill. If it's specifically defensive, then it would say that they don't bear the shield for no reason, right? So a shield would be plenty to defend yourself if it was exclusively defensive, or perhaps a staff, something that is not pokey, right? That can kill another person. So police officers are the extension of the government, right? They are sort of the government put into action. So when they carry a gun, modern equivalent of a sword, right? This weapon, they don't carry it for no reason. They carry it so that if someone needs to be killed, they can be killed. Now, I don't want to put anyone on the spot here because this is something that is a difficult concept. What about capital punishment? Anybody have a strong feeling they'd like to share, or do you just want to let me run my tape to make sure you don't say the wrong thing?
The Bible does include the government, and the government is therefore, the way I read it, is allowed to do that as a way of protecting society.
Yes. So the government is allowed to do it.
Right. Doesn't mean they have to.
There was.
Doesn't mean they have to. Yes, absolutely.
If you're allowed to do it, doesn't mean you have to.
Yes. So we'll come back to that because you're going a good direction. Mr. Mells.
My husband, when we were in Wyoming, had helped with chaplaincy with the soldiers. And a lot of them wouldn't come to church or didn't think they were savable because the fact that they had killed. And they took that very seriously. Mm-hmm. And John had to try and convince them that they did it because it was part of what they were supposed to do. But a lot of them still, to this day, have trouble with accepting the fact that they have to kill people.
Okay, give me a thumbs up if you can hear the other people talking. Can you hear the other people talking? Okay. Yeah, so it is nothing to take lightly, even in a completely necessary scenario. Now, the county that I worked in, the city that I worked in, we had 150 deaths a year, homicides a year. So I've had my fair share of killings.
What does homicide mean?
Homicide is the killing of another person. They determine in criminal intention or criminal action after that, but justified or not, it is still a homicide. But even when people do it for the most understandable, if we could say the best reasons, it's a heavy burden. It's very difficult. I never had to kill anyone. I'm very, very thankful for that. I was in a few situations where I probably should, but by the grace of God, nobody had to die. And I'm glad, because I would struggle with it too. Any moral person would still struggle with having had to have taken someone else's life. Because we are all created in the image of God, right? And even someone who is a bad guy, or being a bad guy in that moment, still created in the image of God, and something has broken that they need to be killed, right? Sin has come in and messed up the whole situation so that someone is in this life or death scenario. So just because they are able to do it doesn't mean that they have to. And that is an excellent segue into, I don't know if it's in this book or not. There's so many books that I keep open. I forget which one's in which book. We talk about in Lutheran doctrine the two kingdoms. Who can tell me what the two kingdoms are? Is that something you've heard of? No?
Kingdom of God.
Close. She said kingdom of God. So we have yes, no? Heaven and earth. Okay, not quite. So we have we'll go with kingdom of God. The religious kingdom, the spiritual kingdom, and the civil kingdom. Right? So we have two different realities that we are living in. The first being the reality of what is to come after death. The reality that whether or not we see angels and demons, they're out here, right? They're here. And so things beyond our understanding, things that we're not going to get to cross that veil and come back, but they're still real, right? That's this God's kingdom. We also have the civil kingdom, right? Whether or not you are Muslim or Christian or atheist or anything else, you still have to obey the speed limit. You still cannot embezzle people. You still have to wait 48 hours for your funds to clear after a stock exchange, or you get a nasty gram from the FCC. Not that I would know. So we have to be good citizens of two different kingdoms. We obey God and we obey man. It's not exclusively a one or the other. If we have to choose, of course, we pick God's kingdom, right? Yes.
Kingdom of heaven is always the one you have to follow.
Yes. So, capital punishment, just because they can doesn't mean they have to. Can we all agree that there have been people executed that should not have been executed? And we don't need to go into specifics, right? I think it's a fair statement to say it's not been right 100% of the time. Can you, as a Christian, say, because it is not always done correctly, I'm going to vote for someone who wants to abolish the death penalty? What's wrong? Abolishing it or voting for the person?
You have to have some sort of law and order. It's the law.
It is the law. It is the law. But what do we do as in this left-hand kingdom, this civil kingdom, right? Well, hopefully you vote. And hopefully the people you vote for represent your views to the best of your ability, right? We don't always have good people to choose from, and some of them were good before I was born. But we do the best we can. So
okay, so you don't know who Pat Paulson is.
I don't know who Pat Paulson is, and I forgot to look him up this last week, but that's my loss.
Really?
That's my loss. So lost my train of thought there. Okay. So as a private citizen, there is a difference. Let me just kind of give you the answer here. There is a difference in saying it is immoral to have the death penalty in place, and in saying I think we need to lessen or even get rid of the death penalty as it is in practice right now. Does that sort of nuanced argument make sense? Right? There's a difference in being a vegetarian, someone who chooses just to eat vegetables, and in being someone who says you are sinning by killing an animal to eat it, right? And it's wrong to lump in everyone into one category or the other. And just like we can appreciate, hey, I raise animals, I spent all day putting them in my freezer today, but it's okay if you don't want to eat my chicken, right? That's fine. That's certainly your choice to make. but it's not a right or wrong thing. And when it comes to the death penalty, what we say as Christians is they have the authority. The government has been given the authority by God to do it. So it is not something that we say is a sin. However, we can also say, I don't like how it's being implemented. Now, frankly, a lot of the arguments against the death penalty, in my opinion, have kind of gone the way of the dodo bird because you're always on video camera now. And there's oftentimes just undeniable evidence, video evidence of exactly what happened. So while I will say personally that I'm fine with the death penalty, I can recognize that someone else who is a Christian will have a different opinion. They may vote differently on that. They may say, I'm not comfortable because of XYZ reasons. And they vote that way. That is okay, right? We can recognize the right and wrong while still operating in the civil realm, trying to bring justice. And it's a fallen world, right? No system is going to be completely perfect. We do the best we can. So recognize the distinction as how it's different, right and wrong versus what we choose to implement and why there are reasons that that's okay. It's a hard thing to do, especially in today's society, to disagree with someone and still be friends. Rarely, but it's a good thing for us to all be working on, right? So that is the sort of two kingdom theology. All right. You know what? Let's go straight to our Bible readings. Who brought a Bible that can do a reading for me? Throw a hand up. Mr. Cocker, James 1, 23 to 25. And then, Ms. McGregor, would you do Matthew 25, verses 42 to 43?
42.
Yes, ma'am. A couple real quick ones. Mr. Cocker, when you're ready, James chapter 1, verses 23 through 25. Matthew 25, verses 42 through 43. But I want to wait and get Mr. Cocker's read first. She beat you in the sword drill. That was a staple of my youth, was the church camp sword drills, right? You had to have a big floppy Bible. And it was tough because the best Christian kids had the floppiest Bibles, but the ones who won the sword drills were the ones who used the real stiff ones because they're easier to flip. It's quite the conundrum. All right, James chapter 1, verses 23 through 25.
Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like a man who looks at his face in the mirror. And after looking at himself, move away and leave when he forgets what he looks like. Man who looks intently into perfect quality of freedom continues to do this, not forgetting what he has heard, but doing it. He will be blessed in what he does.
All right, so James is a very difficult book, right? It's quite possibly the most difficult book in the New Testament. Does anybody have an opinion they want to share on that as to why that is? It's a law book, right? It's do this, do that. If you have real faith, then it's going to look like this. And if you don't do this, then clearly you have no faith. It's a hard book, right? But what it's saying there is that, you know, this person who looks in the mirror, person who has revealed to them what is actually going on and doesn't do it, right? That's kind of the fool. And that you may not be making the connection just yet between that verse and the fifth commandment on murder. Go ahead, if you would, please. Matthew 25, verses 42 through 43.
The king will say to them, whenever you fail to help any of my people, no matter how unimportant they seem, you fail to do it for me. Then Jesus said that those people will be punished forever, but the ones who play God will have eternal life. Who please God will have eternal life. Is there some more?
Go ahead and read one more verse, would you?
That's all I have in this book.
Okay. I may have given you the wrong reference. 25, 42, and 43. Let me read it in read it out of my large catechism. Maybe it's noted differently. All right, so I'm reading from the Large Catechism on the Fifth Commandment, section 191. If that means nothing to you, that's okay. God also rightly calls all people murderers who do not provide counsel and help in distress and danger of body and life. He will pass a most terrible sentence upon them in the last day, as Christ himself has announced that he will say, quote, I was hungry and you gave me no food. I was thirsty and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger and you did not welcome me, naked and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison and you did not visit me. This means you would have allowed me and mine to die of hunger, thirst, and cold. You would have allowed the wild beasts to tear us to pieces, or left us to rot in prison or perish in distress. What else is that but to rebuke them as murderers and bloodhounds? For although you have not actually done all this to someone, you have still, so far as you were concerned, let him wither and perish in misfortune. So let me read again the fifth commandment. Grab my right one here. You should fear and love God so we do not hurt or harm our neighbor in his body, but help and support him in every physical need. Right? So we tie all this together. Jesus says, you see these people that are needy, they don't have clothes, they don't have food, they don't have shelter, and you walk past them. He says the same thing to you on the last day. And we see in the fifth commandment, that it's the inverse of murder, right? Yes, you can kill someone, but you can also leave them in their sickness and at their point of death and not help them. And you are just as guilty of violating this fifth commandment as if you had actually killed them. Right? Jesus turns up the intensity on these commandments, right? This one and then the sixth commandment that we'll get to in a moment, right? Because he says, you know what, we'll start the sixth commandment now, because the murder one, I think. Does anybody have any questions about capital punishment, about the nuance, about murder? I think we covered it okay. Yeah. All right, so the sixth commandment on adultery. Jesus is going to say at some point, if you look at another person with lust in your heart, then you have committed adultery, right? So Jesus turns up the intensity. Not only is it not actually shooting someone, but it's not helping them when they have been hurt. Not only is it not actually breaking your marriage vows, but it's looking at someone with lust in your heart. We all break them all, right? That's the truth, is that we all break them all. So, sixth commandment. Before we start talking about it, let's read it. Give everyone a second to grab the congregation at prayer page, bottom of the first page. What is the sixth commandment? What does this mean?
We should fear and love God, so that we lead a sexually pure and decent life in what we say and do, and husband and wife love and honor each other.
So, let me say this too before we get too far in the fifth or sixth commandment. So I talked with the parents of our confirmands. Now the Osterbers they're going to listen to this online. But I talked to all the parents first, and I was like, sixth commandment's a hard one, but we need to talk about it. Here's what we're going to say, and they all gave it the green light. If you think it's awkward talking about adultery in church, at least you don't have both your son and your parents listening at the same time. I'm going to win in the awkward category here. So, yeah, so there's that. All right. So, first of all, let's define a couple terms. Adultery is the breaking of marriage vows, right? Fornication, that you'll see elsewhere, is that same sin, but not related to marriage. As a single person with another single person, that is fornication. That distinction is there. The reason why it's adultery in the Ten Commandments, from what we read in the Catechism, the commentary, they say that all of the Jews were actually expected to get married. And I didn't know that until researching actually for this class, that they were all expected to get married. So they just simplify it by saying, don't commit adultery because you're going to be getting married at some point, and that's all there is to it. So an interesting note, certainly nothing binding on any of us. Let me switch books here. Sixth commandment, yes. All right, I'm going to read that top paragraph, excerpts from the Large Catechism on the Sixth Commandment. The fifth through the 10th commandments are all to show that we must avoid doing any kind of harm to our neighbor, but they are arranged in fine order. In the first place, they talk about our neighbor personally. Then they proceed to talk about the person nearest him, or the closest possession next after his body, namely his wife. She is one flesh and blood with him, so that we cannot inflict a higher injury upon him in any good that is his. Therefore, it is clearly forbidden here to bring any disgrace upon our neighbor regarding his wife. Okay. So, probably all of us have at one point in time had our spouse insulted. Right?
Yeah.
Does anything make you go through the roof quicker than your spouse being insulted? Maybe your kids in a different way, but is there anything worse? Right? Would you rather have a scratch in your car or a scratch on your wife's face? Right? Yeah, yeah, car. So the reason that it starts with this adultery business is because it's the most personal and most hurtful sin that you could commit against another person. To whom, and I'll say it both ways, but to whom does the wife's body belong? God first, but who? To her husband. To her husband, right? That's what St. Paul says. To whom does the husband's body belong?
To God first.
To God first, and then to his wife. Yeah, right? So they belong to each other. So this adultery business, whether you are alone, whether you think you are alone, whether you are with another person, they are all sinning against another person, right? The other person being the one to whom you are the most indebted, hopefully the most committed to, most in love with, right? So it's a big deal. There's no way to break this and not hurt someone else. So here's where it's going to get just a little uncomfortable for a minute, but I really think we need to talk about it. Sex ed is something that not that long ago was put on public schools. And that is not a responsibility that public school should really have, or any school, right? Any elementary school should not be the ones teaching. It should be coming from home, from the parents and from the pastor, and not from a kindergarten teacher. It's uncomfortable, right? Who wants to talk about that stuff? No, I'm lucky in that when my little ones have a medical question, I'm like, oh, ask Mama, she's the doctor. I don't know where you came from. Mommy's tummy's all I know. But there's more to it than that, right? And we as the church, it's too easy to say, don't say the S word, don't think about the S word, and just don't until you're married, and then it will all make sense, right? You will magically figure it out once you are married. And so just don't look me in the eye while we talk about this, and let's go get pizza. But we do a disservice to ourselves and to our children when we leave it so open-ended. Now, I don't want to put Nick on the spot, so I won't. But you look at the sort of things that are getting taught in school, it's basically that all morality, sexual morality, is subjective. And whatever you and another consenting person think is good, is good. And for me to say any act is bad or wrong or silly or weird is called kink shaming. Kink shaming is the greatest sin you can commit, right? But it gets weird, yeah, kink shaming. But it gets weird in that you have usually, like comedians, it's been lately, or movie directors, where they do things consensually, but then they get called out on it months, weeks, or decades later. And they say, oh, either I wasn't consenting or I didn't realize I could consent, or so there's these competing ideologies, right? There's nothing wrong. Anything you want to do is good. Also, if in retrospect you decide that was a bad idea, then the other person should go to jail and lose their job. And none of it meshes, right? And when you look at sticking with that same analogy of comedians and TV producers, in retrospect, right, there is discomfort about what was done from years and years before, right? There's, first of all, what we need to say is that there is forgiveness. And we have all broken all of the commandments, right? So before you think, well, you know, so-and-so had a baby out of wedlock, or so-and-so's not married, or so-and-so is fooling around, right? There is forgiveness, and we all need it, all of us, to various degrees. It is neither helpful nor necessary for us to try and draw lines here of who needs the most forgiveness and how much better we are. Because this one's kind of visible, right? And it's juicy. We love talking about people getting caught. There's a whole TV show about cheaters, and the host ended up getting stabbed. And you guys remember that? It was in like the early 2000s, late 90s. Yeah, it was a TV show called Cheaters. And they would, kind of like Chris Hansen, they'd expose these cheaters. And they did it on a boat, and the guy just stabs the host. But it made great television, I guess. That's, you know, what you're into. But I digress. There is something shameful about being exposed in retrospect. So here are my I'm going to say rules. That's more formal than what I would like, but it works. My rules for sex are that what it should be is vulnerability and security, right? Vulnerability and security. Because what is the most vulnerable you can be, right? If you're talking to a military guy, they're going to be like, well, not having my body armor and my rifle with me, right? Or somebody may say, oh, you know, if I'm in a dark alley without my concealed carry. There is no more vulnerable position to be in than totally undressed, right? And it is not just the literal, how much weight you carry on your frame and where you have a mole and where you have wrinkles or whatever, but it's also representative, right? Of who we are as a person, and everything that we are is laid bare to someone, to this other person. Vulnerable. But what makes it beautiful is security, right? So when you get married, till death do you part. Now again, we live in a sinful, fallen world. Sometimes things happen and we don't end up staying married to that same person forever. It would be better if we did, right? In the same way that it would be better if there were no kids to adopt. It doesn't take away from the fact that adopted families are complete families and wonderful families and a great example of what God does for us, right? It doesn't take anything away from that to say it'd be better if those kids didn't have to go through that. It would be better if no marriage ended in divorce. But we all sin, every one of us. And things happen that we wish didn't happen, and then we make the best of them. God forgives us, and great things can come out of God's forgiveness, right? So we're not taking away from that. And if anyone here is on their second marriage or something like that, I don't know everybody's story. This is not targeting at you. We're just talking about what God has for us and how we can process it all. So we have vulnerability and we have security. Because this may surprise you, I'm a few pounds heavier than I was in my 20s. Probably not alone, but it is what it is, right? I don't worry about that with my wife, right? I don't have to think, oh my goodness, she's giving me the stink eye because, you know, I haven't spent enough time on the treadmill. My wife loves me unconditionally. Spouses love each other unconditionally, whatever may happen, right? And so the beauty in the relationship comes not from a release of hormones or endorphins or whatever else. It's the fact that when you are most vulnerable and exposed, you know that you are loved unconditionally and that nothing will change that. This person is always here for you, right? So the opposite of that, going back to what I kind of referred to as my 4 rules, is that, would you mind filling that up for me? I am thirsty today. Pain and shame do not belong in a marriage. So pain and shame do not belong in a marriage. and again, I know this is a little bit uncomfortable for myself included to be talking about this. There are those who get enjoyment through physical pain, right? That doesn't belong. There are those who get physical release out of shaming another person, right? That sort of, I'm blanking on the subordinate dominant stuff, right? Being put into these uncomfortable relationships, right? Well, what is that doing? That is violating the security, right? Because if you are intimate with another person and they, I don't know, do something weird, they spit in your face or they call you a horrible name, right? Well, that's terrible. That is the opposite of what should be happening, right? You should be secure in that moment. So there's a wrong way to have a marriage relationship. And it's not just outside of marriage, right? We can have, it can be wrong inside of marriage too. And it's important for the young ones among us to understand that. It's not just don't put your hands in a girl's shirt until you're married. There's more to it than that, because what happens when you get married? What happens when you're 24 years old and you are nothing but adrenaline, right? And we can see it other ways too. What about caffeine, right? Not to hit any nerves, but there's a lot of people who drinks a cup of coffee to get through studying at night. And then you're in your 30s or 40s and it's like, oh, I drink 6 quarts of coffee a day just to stave off the shakes and the blinding headaches, right? It's not good for you. And somewhere along the way, you're just pushing the limits. Something that people used to say, and I disagree with it, is that with like drugs, you're always chasing your first high. And I don't see it that way. I did do a lot of drugs. I was involved with a lot of drugs. And I to use common parlance, I think you can catch a dragon pretty easily. You can grab its tail. I think the problem is it's not what you remember, in the sense of it's the escalation more so than the experience itself, right? And so when you're young, bringing it back to relationships, when you're young and it's the taboo nature and it's the pushing your limits and it's finding your limits, you're harming another person in doing so, right? Because it's never supposed to be about finding your limits. It's not supposed to be about what is the highest endorphin rush that I can get in this moment. It's about the relationship. Vulnerability, but security. Pain and shame undermine these things. And again, if you think of extramarital relationships, there is no security in an extramarital relationship whatsoever, right? Or a one-night stand where you're intentionally just going to hook up with somebody for fun for a night and then move on to whatever else comes next. There's no security in that at all. Quite the opposite, right? And how many people get into trouble for years down the road because they sent some pictures they wish they didn't send, or allowed some pictures to be taken that they shouldn't have, right? Well, they don't owe you anything, right? No harm, no foul. This is just for fun. And if I enjoy humiliating someone else, right? Where's the harm in that? This was never about you and me anyway. This was just about us enjoying ourselves for an evening. Right? Wrong is wrong, right? And so both things are true, right? And that's where I think it's important that especially the young, that they hear that, right? It's not just once you get married, everything's good. It's once you get married, then you have God's blessing and you're going to start a family because that's how he has ordained things. But even in that, right, we make our spouses feel loved. We make them feel secure. We don't ever belittle them, especially during intimate times. We don't ever shame them, never, right? There's never a good time for these things. There's never an exception to the rule of how we treat other people, especially that person who's closest to us. So I'll just say it one more time, just because I think it's worth remembering, and I think it's worth thinking about. So vulnerability and security, those two in tandem, are what makes the marriage bed special. And the inverse of that being that pain and shame have no business in that relationship, especially there, but anywhere. Does anyone have any comments to make on that?
You have at least in my mind, the question of rape.
Mhm.
And I personally feel that rape can exist in a marriage.
Mhm.
I mean, just because you're married doesn't mean that you have the right as a person to anything with that other person.
Sure.
Well, I think rape exists within that.
So it is a
Which
controversial.
doesn't make it right.
Correct. So I had the controversial opinion when I was in law enforcement, and I maintain it today, that there's a difference between rape and sexual misconduct. In Indiana, and I can't speak for North Carolina, I'm not nearly as versed, but there's a distinction between rape and sexual misconduct. And it is of my opinion that the two are different. Rape involving, well, let me put it this way. When you get married, right? What's the one thing that changes, that everybody acknowledges changes, right? You're going to be sleeping in the same bed. You are going to have children unless something is done to stop that, right? So there is that intentional entering into a legally binding contract, right? That does not mean that you cannot sin against another person by forcing yourself on them. There is absolutely misconduct. And I only say this because I've had this debate many times, and it's more a legal debate than anything, because I do think that you can sin against another person. I just think there's a difference in someone in a husband-wife relationship and in someone in the bushes at the mall. And so when I was in court, making distinctions, that was important to me. But yes, so when you have mismatched drives, right? Be it man or woman, whoever direction that goes, it is true that a spouse's body belongs to their spouse. And St. Paul says that you should not be withholding yourself from your spouse. But if we go back to my made up rules here, right? If you take advantage of that vulnerability, that's not right either, right? Because that person, that woman, has willingly given herself to you for the rest of her life. And in order to take something from her that she wishes to give generously, but not right then, is to take advantage of that vulnerability, and it takes away from her security, right? She should feel secure that you have her best interest at heart. And there's a reason why the last of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control, right? It's a hard one, self-control. But it's something that we have to learn to exercise as Christians, and sometimes we fail at it. But working through that with your spouse. And additionally, just because I like to construct arguments here, part of the reason why it's not based on endorphins and dopamine and everything else, right? What happens when we get older? You get cancer, right? You get for more of us than probably we would like to discuss. Things stop working the way they did in your 20s to various degrees at various times. Noah and I were just talking on the way here about, because he was trying to get his head around age a little bit and strength. And I said, yeah, when you get older, yes, you're stronger, but also things start breaking down faster. I said, how often do you wake up sore? He's like, almost never. He's like, wait, do you wake up sore? Like, oh, buddy, just wait. You start waking up sore, right? So things change. And if you enter into a marriage relationship because your spouse is hot, she is good looking, right? And she makes you feel things you ain't felt before. and I don't know, she makes good biscuits and gravy. What happens when the doctor says, hey, your cholesterol's out of whack, no more biscuits and gravy? And what happens after 5 babies when she ain't as hot as she was in college? But then what happens when you get prostate cancer, or not prostate cancer, because not everyone gets cancer when they get old, but you are unable to perform, right? It's hard. It's a hard situation. But how?
You still love that person, though,
But
right?
you still love that person.
Yeah.
Because vulnerability and security does not depend upon physical contact. It does not depend upon whatever I can generate in your head based on how I touch you, right? And that's the sort of thing that you don't even realize when you're in your teens and 20s, that you can have this depth of relationship outside of that, because that's all you think, right? Gotta wait till I get married so that mom and dad and the pastor don't get mad. But then it's going to be great. And I don't know what these old people are talking about, but like, it's going to be different with me because I'm a stud, right? Hey, it's true. We all thought it at one point in time. And we have all gotten older in various ways. But again, I think you appreciate as you get older, and especially as our bodies start breaking down, you start appreciate this person who loves you unconditionally, right? They push you in the wheelchair after surgery, right? Maybe they do something humiliating, like help you when you're using the restroom. Because they love you. Because what else would they do, right? Whenever you need them, when you are at your weakest point, they're there for you. You're secure in your spouse. So much more than just the act. And that goes farther outside of marriage too, right? Because I don't just have to take my clothes off to hurt my spouse. If I look at another person, yeah, maybe that's hurtful. Maybe she knows men are pigs. Maybe it doesn't bother her, but it should, right? But what about if I start calling Sally up the street, right? And we start having just these really nice talks because she gets me. Or what if we start calling Bill up the road because when he fixes the problem, he fixes it right. And I don't have to keep harassing him to, fix the water leak in the bathroom, because he's actually going to come do it. He comes when I need him. Right? What about that, right? That violates a person's security in that relationship. It's hurtful. And I'm not saying don't call a plumber. You know what I'm saying, right? We can enter into these relationships with other people that are hurtful. So it's a hard one, but it's one that is so fulfilling. And again, I'll just end by saying it again. Divorce happens. I would go so far and listen to the whole thing that I say. I would go so far as to say that divorce is not good, but sometimes it's necessary, right? So there's a difference in saying, hooray, I'm divorced, right? Time to go party. And in saying, oh, I loved that person. They loved me. Because of sin, wherever that relationship ended, I need forgiveness. I need to move on. And good things can come, right? Good things can come. I have relatives who are adopted. Again, same thing. It'd be better if they didn't have to go through that. But just like how God redeems all of us, God redeemed my little niece's life, gave her a great family, right? So we can be blessed even in spite of ourselves and in spite of people we trust who wrong us too. Okay? So is that enough on that?
You have to forgive, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, I'm on my first marriage. I've been married 13 years. But does that mean I've never committed adultery? Jesus says, you look at a woman with lust in your heart, right? So unless I want to disagree with Jesus, then you pick anybody who's on their 5th, 6th, 19th marriage, who's got a baby that they shouldn't have, right? Well, hey, I'm no better than you. Jesus says I did the same thing you did. Just because mine's less visible does not mean I'm less of a sinner, right? So forgiveness is something we all need. And I would say especially in that, because it's so difficult. All right, it is 6:53. Does anybody else have anything to add on this? Any nuggets of wisdom from those of you who've been married for a long time? Anything you'd like to share? Be happy to hear.
Realize when you get older, snack crackle pop is not cereal.
Snap, crackle, pop is not cereal.
Stand up, my cows, whose knee was that?
Oh, I hear that. And ibuprofen is something that, like, oh, that's good. That's the good stuff. You want to go to the doctor and get the good stuff? It's the ibuprofen. Did you have something to add? I thought Diane was going to say something. I want to make sure everyone has a chance to be heard. All right. Well, very well. I was nervous about that. I've been thinking about this all week. Like, how do I talk about this in a way that's helpful? Because it's got to be a little awkward. I don't know. What did Jonathan say to you? Anything? I'm looking at you, Nick. I talked to your stepdad and told him what I was going to say. And he's like, I'm good with it. I didn't know if he told you anything. He was like, surprise the boy, it'll be fun.
Like, I'm not saying, I went to public school already.
Yeah. Well, and okay, so he says he went to public school here and he knows everything. First of all, I believe that. I do believe that. And second of all, that's why we have to have hard conversations, right? Because if all they get is do whatever you want and we have doctors to fix the consequences, then our kids get in bad spots, right? Because they're hearing it. They need to hear from their parents, their grandparents, wherever your station is in life, something, right? The church has an answer. We have something we can say that is helpful for you, that will guide you in the right way. And it's not just, don't do it till you're married and don't tell me about it. Yeah. So, all righty. Let's move on. Honestly, I thought that was going to take longer. We got a little time. Let's start up with the 7th commandment. 7th, yeah, we're going to move ahead a little bit. All right, I will just read this since you don't have it on your paper. All right, so the 7th commandment, you shall not steal. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not take our neighbor's money or possessions or get them in any dishonest way, but help him to improve and protect his possessions and income. And I'll continue reading the excerpt from the Large Catechism. After the commandment about you personally and your spouse, next comes the commandment about temporal property. God also wants property protected. He has commanded that no one shall take away from or diminish his neighbor's possessions. Briefly, this includes all kinds of advantage and all sorts of trade to the disadvantage of our neighbor. To steal means not only emptying our neighbor's money box and pockets, it also means grasping property in the market, in all stores, booths, wine and beer cellars, workshops, and in short, wherever there is trading or taking and giving of money for merchandise or labor. The monks drank beer like constantly. So you always see reference to these beer and wine cellars because that was important to them. They loved their beer. Kept them safe through a couple of plagues too, because the yeast outcompete the bacteria, but that's not related. So this one is super relevant, right? The housing crisis. What's happening? BlackRock, right? This multi-billion-dollar corporation is buying up neighborhoods at a time. Neighborhoods. I'm not talking a condo. I'm talking like an entire cul-de-sac and the 3 cul-de-sacs next to it. And then starting a management company, and then we're going to rent to you, and you're going to like it because you don't have any other choices, right? My cousin lives in New York City, and he's splitting a student. This is a year or two old, so he may have moved.
I said, I'm sorry.
Oh,
He lives in New York.
oh, I agree with you. I agree with you completely. I would never want to live in New York City. You passed your time, so whenever you all need to go, I will not be offended. So he lives in a studio apartment in New York City, splits it with 4 guys. They each pay $1,000 a month for a studio. It's unreal. It is absolutely unreal. Huh? It's very expensive. That's very expensive. So we have these people that can't afford to live, right? You're forced into being a renter. Well, that's stealing, right? Taking away these people's ability to actually own a house, taking away their ability to do that. That's theft. All right, let's see here. What was the other one I wanted to touch? Yeah, trade to the disadvantage of our neighbor, right? So Miss McGregor needed a new transmission, right? Now, I hope that they did her right, whatever right is. But you need a new transmission, you're hosed, right? You're kind of at the mercy of the transmission people, and you hope that the transmission people do you fairly, right? Now, you could say, I've got an in-demand product, right? Supply and demand, that's capitalism. It's not my fault that there's 7 other old ladies that need transmissions, right? So supply and demand, I'm going to profit from that. But that's stealing still. That's violating the commandment on stealing because it is to the disadvantage of your neighbor. So the difficult part of this, what's the question then? What's the question on this? Well, we'll stick with the transmission example, just because we've already brought it up.
The fair market value.
Who determines the fair market value, right? You got me. I don't know, right?
All of us.
I suppose, in a sense, all of us. In a sense, there is capitalism in a free market that theoretically balances itself out, right? I mean, goodness sakes, have you bought a TV lately? I bought a 65-inch TV a month ago for like $300, and it fit in the back of my van to go home, right? So because people wanted it, so I don't know, China started making TVs and it balanced out. How do we conduct business? Because the transmission guy's got to eat, right? Transmission guy's got to feed his family. How do we conduct business that is not to the disadvantage of our neighbor? What are some ideas?
Reasonable prices.
Reasonable prices, yeah, reasonable prices.
A reasonable markup on your labor.
A reasonable markup, yeah.
Don't be a monopoly.
Don't be a monopoly. I would say that being a monopoly encourages you to make bad choices, more so than the monopoly itself being bad. Because, if I'm the only game in town, well, how do I know if my prices are fair? And then I can just kind of start creeping up, and that makes it difficult. I say that because if I start breeding these naked neck chickens, I'm going to be the only naked neck chicken breeder in town. And, I don't know. I mean, maybe you can breed some and we can compete against each other, but I don't want to get myself in trouble too much if I'm the only guy in town. Is it fair to say, and tell me if it's not, is it fair to say you can see when someone else is being taken advantage of? A lot of the time. A lot of the time. Remember last time when we talked about what it means to be disciplined enough that you don't need the reading plan, right? As you read scriptures and as you desire to read scriptures and as the Holy Spirit works on you, things become more clear, right? And so to stick with the transmission example, I may know that Miss McGregor needs a transmission and that the fair price for that is, we'll say $200 in profit for me, just to throw out an arbitrary number, $200, right? If I know that she's not going to balk at $300, I still should take the $200, right? Conversely, let's make it a personal example. Let's say she comes to my house and says, hey, David, can you help me drop in a new transmission in my little car? And we put it up I pick it up with the tractor, right? Am I going to take $200 from her? You can say no. No, I'm not going to take $200 from you. Right?
But what about your cost?
So here's the thing. When we prioritize other people's welfare above ours, it doesn't have to be about the cost, right? There are bigger things at play than just the cost. We have the Helping Hands ministry, right? We had a member of our church put in a new door a couple months ago. Now, our old door was crummy, and it was somebody ripped it off of a saw because it was not a standard size. And if you had to pay a carpenter, it would have been probably a couple $1,000s to reframe it. It was a day's work. It was gas, right? Pretty sure that man didn't take a couple $1,000s from his church. I don't know that for a fact. Pretty sure he didn't take a couple $1,000s from his church. Why?
His conscience.
Because he was doing it out of the goodness of his heart, because of his conscience, right? So do these things bleed over with one another?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely, right? So when we are focused on loving God, loving our neighbor, we do things like give our time to put in a new door. We do things like help her with the transmission. Now, you know what? If I'm a transmission shop, I'm probably going to take a little off top because I got to feed my family, right? But rather than getting bogged down on the business principle, because even as we're talking about it, it's hard, right? How much is a fair markup? We can get bogged down on how do we best serve our neighbor? Because I don't own a transmission shop. So if Miss McGregor needs help, well, now it's not about money at all. It's about me taking care of a sweet old lady, middle-aged lady. Right. And if I'm in the habit of taking care of nice old ladies, when I do go to do business, it's never about the money, right? Yeah, sure. I need money. I need to eat. I got to buy food for my chickens, right? 50-pound sacks aren't free. That's not about the money. So why do you care, right? It's this mindset change. It's love for other people permeating your whole life to the point where, well, why are we even talking about that, right? Why are we trying to talk about markups? Let's talk about how we can take care of one another. Where were you when I was hungry and had no food? When I was naked and had no clothes, right? And then the inverse of that, do you remember what the inverse of that is? And we'll close with this because I know we're a little short on time here. What was the inverse of that?
Peter told the least of these, you have done it unto me.
Yeah, so we're going to get to that last day, and Jesus is going to say, hey, you fed me. You put clothes on me. You put a roof over my head. And we are told that we will say, Lord, when did I do that? Right? Because we don't realize it. But our Heavenly Father puts himself in the place of these people that are needy. Right? And so we serve God quite literally and quite directly by serving each other in these very basic ways. So that would be my encouragement with the seventh commandment. Don't get hung up over the how much. Get hung up over the taking care of one another, helping someone else improve their status, however that may be. And then the rest of it will sort itself out. All right. Any other questions about that one? Other than, will I really put a transmission in your car? I would try, but you probably are better off taking it to a shop, for us. So.
Well, they have to use their conscience too, don't they?
They do. They do.
And well, whatever they do in business, like compare price, what he paid for it, and the labor and stuff like that. But they have to do that. But I think you can still use your conscience.
Absolutely. And a worker is worth his due, right? It's right to pay people who are doing things for you. Yeah. Just because we're Christians doesn't mean that we need to go 100% broke right away. That's not the point either.
And that's the same way we look at when we hire a minister. You know, we pay them, the ministers go and raise. Mm-hmm. Whether we feel like, I don't know if the church can afford all that, you know, or if they, you know, they're doing it, that was their calling, and so they need to be living dirt poor. Well, that isn't what God commanded us to do.
Certainly we want to take care of those who take care of us to the best of our abilities. Funny side note on that, a good friend of mine is the pastor. I think I probably said this as much. He's the pastor in Beverly Hills, and his parish is worth like $1.2 million. And it's like a 3-bedroom, 3-bedroom, like 1,200 square feet or something. But he lives in Beverly Hills. He's got $1 million house. Pretty cool. So.
Is that Michigan or California?
California. It's Sherman.
Beverly Hills, Michigan is expensive.
Is it really? Well, I guess maybe it comes with the name, huh? Yeah, Sherman Oaks Lutheran, Titus Utah. Have I ever seen the Beverly Hillbillies Mansion?
No, I mean the one that you're talking about.
I don't know if he has seen the Beverly Hillbillies Mansion, but I'll text him.
I know who owns it.
Do you really? Is it Wendy?
No, it's Chris Brown.
Oh, okay. I'm so glad Wendy let you out so you can come tonight. Usually these conversations are easier. They're not usually this difficult. You came on an exceptionally difficult night. All right. So yeah, well, some of them have been, but I think it's good that we take the time to chew on this stuff, right? Because we can say the 10 Commandments and the Catechism are for children, and we can move on from it. But I think it's worth our time to stop and think about it, right? How can we work these things into our lives? We never outgrow the Catechism. We never outgrow the 10 Commandments. Yeah. So I'm so thankful that you all chose to come spend your time here. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to say?
Whole list.
You have a whole list? Is it best to save it for the car ride home, or do we want to talk about it now?
One question.
Okay.
What is raping?
Rape is to force a sexual encounter on another person. So when the rooster chases down a hen and she's squawking, that's the idea, but with people. So, yeah.
How does that work?
Well, it's a violent act. It's something terrible. That's why it's so serious, is because it is a terrible, terrible thing. And I'm glad that you don't have a frame of reference to where you can conceive of that. I think that means that we're doing some stuff good at home. All right. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, he's smirking. That's not good.
At what approximate age am I going to get kids?
Yeah.
23. What is monogamy?
I hope never. I hope never.
Probably 23.
I hope never. Let me give you something pseudo serious, because I want you to feel only moderately guilty about this. So when my sister got cancer, this was, how many years ago was it? Hold up fingers. 6 years ago, my older sister got cancer, and my wife went to, the girls were all going to shave their heads, and I went to work, and as soon as I said that, my beat partner's name is Marvin Bankhead, detective, just greatest guy ever, solid Christian guy, helped me out so much. He goes, "Let her." And I was like, "Yeah, but I let her." He said, "You let that woman shave her head and you support her. Don't you dare tell her what she looks like. You make sure she knows that this is worth it and she is still just as beautiful to you, and don't you dare stop her." So I still don't fully understand why women have to shave their head, but I know that some of them have to do it. And I know in retrospect, I'm glad that he had that very angry talk with me, because it was the right thing. So
My daughter-in-law had cancer, and she ended up losing all of her beautiful hair. And she ended up shaving too, which I think in the long run, it was better, because at least she knew it was her choice, not the cancer's choice. Or the treatment.
Well, it's the treatment, not the cancer, actually.
Right.
If you have cancer, you don't lose
Oh,
your hair as
trust
part
me,
of the cancer, you
no.
lose it. Yeah.
But it's the one part that she had control over.
Right, she had control over it, and we applauded her the whole way. And her hair grew back when she was a little further along, her hair grew back.
but it goes back to what we were saying before about loving one another, right? Supporting and taking care of our neighbor, and in ways that not all of us will understand. Not all of us will be able to participate. Wouldn't do me any good if I shaved my head to support anybody, right? I'm already bald. Yeah, they wouldn't. So, all right, everybody.
What is Monopoly?
We'll save that for home. We'll save that for the car ride home, because it's 7:13, which is the perfect time for us to be wrapped up. And I think I've already said my final thank yous. So let's all close with the Lord's Prayer. Okay. Lord, remember us in your kingdom and teach us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses,
as we forgive those
who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever.
Amen.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.